So we have a little bit of a new meta. I know it's kind of weird to say. We haven't done a meta video in almost 2.5 months because we were dominated by the XM4 and then the Jackal. They've received multiple nerfs and other guns have received buffs. And we've also got new guns like the PPSH, which we'll go ahead and kind of talk about some various options. I think because some people play big map versus small map, ranked versus unranked, there's going to be a little bit of variance, but we'll go ahead and talk through some of those as we go through the options. And like we normally do, we have the spreadsheet linked in the description. So if you want to go ahead and check out, hey, what is the TTK at the furthest range or the closest range? This is going to give you a most common TTK, but true game data on his site, you can kind of look at the metrics because sometimes it's this difference of like, why aren't people using the SOG? Well, if you get one stomach shot, then you get a bad TTK. So that's why you can't focus just on chest. You kind of have to look at the full picture. So today where we're going to be focusing on a lot of these guns. The main ones for long range we're talking about is the Model L. I think that's going to be the jack of all trades for a lot of people. AMES is a good alternative, low recoil, but feels a little bit weaker. XM4, definitely still pretty good, low recoil, but doesn't hit as hard, so it feels a little bit weaker. XMGs and LMG, very good. Economy feels like a rifle. Hits pretty decently hard, but a little bit slow. Goblin, you can see it's a different color. This one's more of a wild card. It is a semi-auto type weapon where it's going to give you some issues if you're not a fan of that. Personally, I'm not a big fan of that, especially when the fire rate is slower than your trigger finger. I think this one's around the 400s. In ranked, you can't use a ammo mod to make it faster fire rate. So it kind of balances out there. AK-74, pretty good, I think, especially for the small maps, but it takes some really good gun control and maybe even 8 attachments to really use this on big map. And then the Cypher is pretty good overall, just nothing special. And then the Krig C is just another option. Sniper support we may focus on at a different time. And then with the SMG meta, it's kind of shaken up a little bit. The main three though to be aware of are the C9, the PPSH, despite some of its issues, and then the KSV, which overall is pretty solid. After that, you could use a Saperi, you could use a SOG if you wanted, and there's a bunch of other options that are all in that range where they're not particularly bad, but you're better off using a C9, PPSH, and KSV, which are all also pretty good ground loot. So when it comes to loadouts, we're going to focus on a few different key elements. So if you're the type where you just skip around and copy the loadout, that's fine, but I'm going to include a lot of different information that I'm going to skip as I breeze through the loadouts in a little bit. So if we look at something like this, it's only going to have 5 attachments, and I'm focusing on 5 attachment builds. People are like, well, why not do 8 attachment? Well, if you can get your loadout consistently, you're getting 8 attachment loadouts, you probably don't need to look up this guide. This is generally for someone who's kind of like unsure where to start, and then we kind of give you some suggestions if you do want to go ahead and kind of hold off on a couple 8 attachment builds, which cost a little bit more at the buy station, or if you give that one loadout and then you got to buy the one gun. It's kind of going to be dependent on your play style, how successful you are, if you're playing with randoms or you're playing with a full stack squad, and it creates too many variables in the loadout, it just gets complicated. We'll focus on the main attachments and then anything on top of that would just purely be additional for your preference. So when it comes to optic, you got a few different options. I think some people like the Kepler reflex because it gives you that Cold War feel. There's a Volsky one. Hopefully I said that right. I probably didn't. And then there's a few others that we'll go through that people seem to like. The Otero red dot, pretty solid. So as I go through the loadout, you're going to be like, well, why are you using this optic? If you watch this part, you're not going to ask that question. So if anyone's asking that question in the comments, I'll know you didn't watch the important part of the video. You just screenshot it, which is also fine, but don't be asking questions on the screenshot portion if I've already explained it in the video. As we go through, we also have the Jason Armory 2X and the Willis 3X. Some of this will depend on your FOV. If you're playing at max FOV, then optics will feel a little bit different. If you're playing at a lower FOV, they'll perform a little bit different. If you're playing Resurgence, big map versus small map will play it a little bit different. So a little bit of preference there. The other preference we have also depending on big map versus smaller map is the barrel, particularly in the long range engagement. For the long range maps, you want probably as much bullet velocity as you can when it comes to barrel. And for closer range engagements like Rebirth Island or Area 99, you might not need as much bullet velocity, and 1,000 is more than enough. You might not need to bump it up to 13, 1400 or whatever, depending on the gun. So in general, if you're playing smaller map, you'll probably lean towards reinforced. But if not, the other one would be the gain twist. If you're playing big map, you probably lean towards gain twist. But if you're not, you can go ahead and go and reinforce barrel. So that's going to be kind of the mix of the two when it comes to the long range meta. And then the remaining attachments will kind of just generally look like this. We generally use a compensator to help with the recoil, since that's probably one of the most important stats. A suppressor if you can stay off the map, but then you might not be able to control the weapon. And then vertical foregrip. And then there you kind of go. You got the extended mag. Usually on SMGs, you might go with the smaller one. Rear grip doesn't really matter. This is why 8 attachments kind of wonky for some of these guns, in my opinion, because they're not really that beneficial for the long range. Close range, you could get a little bit more movement out of it. But in general, for these, maybe you want more strafe speed, but then that'll throw off your aim. So you kind of got to pick what works best. Maybe you're worried about flinch. If you want a little bit of flinch resistance, combat stock could be pretty good. Or you use a balanced stock, and that's kind of the main ones you're going to use for long range. Laser, not all that important. And then you got ammo mod, overpressured, or recoil springs will be the main two you go with, depending on what you're trying to solve on the gun. If it feels like it doesn't have enough bullet velocity, you go overpressured. If you feel like yourself is struggling to control the recoil springs may be the way to go. And that's when you have those additional attachments. Since we're doing 5 attachment build, this is what your AK-74 would look like. When we cover an SMG, we'll go ahead and talk about how some of those attachments will differ. So overall, this one's going to be one that is pretty good overall. We have the AK-74 with this particular optic. And what you'll notice, it doesn't look like it's particularly hard to use. But as targets get a little bit further away, it could be a little bit more bouncy. And the 50 meters, if you're really good, you can be consistent with that. But the 100 meter, that's going to be super consistent. Even for the top players, they could probably get a kill over there. But it's going to be a little bit too bouncy. And the slower fire rate is going to just cause you to miss more shots. So probably a little bit less viable on long range. And if you're going to use this on big map, you want to force those engagements to be within about 70 meters. So you can still maximize the gun's power, which is pretty good. And the new Cypher, I don't think it's particularly special. You can see the 5 attachments there. Overall, I think this is a pretty good gun. I think it could be built a little bit faster than maybe some of the other guns. But I think this one's more of a Rebirth Island style gun. It's fun to mix it up. Not hard meta by any means. We already kind of went through the breakdown of kind of where the meta sits. This one feels like pretty fast firing, pretty low recoil, relatively easy to use. It beams. I just don't think it does enough damage. In the furthest range, you can see it's still pretty accurate. My aim assist is locking onto each one. It's kind of messed up because I was shooting straight on the first one and whatever. Regardless, it doesn't really have a fast TTK relative to the other ones based off feel, right? Like that's just not how it works. So overall, pretty good gun. I think you're good like on a small map where your engagements are much closer and where like the damage, you can take advantage of the second damage drop off. But realistically, this gun, it gets a little bit beat out. And then we get into the next category. Since we only have 3 short range options, those will only be in the top 3 loadouts that I'm going to talk about. But overall, we got a wild card here. So we got XMG and the Goblin. So when it comes to the Goblin, you can kind of see basic build. Luckily, you don't really need much. If you were going to go extra attachments, you can actually go the fire mod for overpressured, because this thing base default 1100 bullet velocity by itself with this build already. So just having the overpressured would get you up an extra 25%, almost 1400. Very low recoil, but also very slow fire rate. A sub 500, 462 is not particularly fast. And then the XMG, pretty much the same build we've had, even though they've nerfed the buffer stock a few times. This is still kind of how you'd build it out. When we go ahead and check these out in the range, this one's going to be pretty low recoil, pretty decent damage, not too bouncy. But the big problem with this one is the reload's going to be a little bit slower. They did speed up a lot of the reloads, so these feel significantly faster. It almost feels like I have sleight of hand on, like that was the whole purpose. So overall, pretty solid option there. And then this one, you can see it's not going to have a ton of recoil, but you're going to have to worry about spam triggering, which is generally going to lean this one probably to be a little bit more forgiving for keyboard and mouse, just because organically they're more used to clicking, spam clicking, versus with triggers, it's generally holding while you're worried about aim assist and strafing and your movement. But overall, it resets itself pretty good. And no matter how fast you pull the trigger, since it does have that hard cap of 460 whatever, it's still going to fire at the same rate no matter how fast you spam it. And it's relatively easy or common. Most people's trigger finger will be between 420 up to about 550, depending on the individual. So that's kind of like right in the average. And this thing deletes. Feels broken because of the bullet velocity you can get, especially with 8 attachments. And overall, because it resets so easy, you don't really have to do much work. But it's a semi-auto, so people might not like it. That one's kind of the sleeper one. I think that was a little more of a higher skill gun that has the potential to be more broken. And will probably get a nerf, even though it just got buffed. But maybe depends on how people adapt to that gun. One quick note on the Goblin, because it is semi-auto, the ported compensator just feels great on this gun. Instead of using the default compensator, that's one thing I'll note, instead, in case you're just copying over, that we're using the ported because it has that single shot accuracy off the first shot. Each shot is a first shot, so it feels really good with semi-auto weapons. Here's where we start getting into the top 3-ish loadouts. I think XM4 is still pretty versatile because of its 100 round mag. Buffer stock is still pretty insane. The gun was pretty solid without the buffer stock. So even if they basically would have to make the buffer stock useless, XM4 would still be decent. The damage nerf is more noticeable on this one. It definitely feels more like weak in that middle to long range. And then we have the KSV. So we'll go ahead and go over this one real quick. Basic loadout, it just has a buffer stock instead of the muzzle, but that's kind of how you'd build it out. Pretty straightforward. You can go the bigger mag if you want. 100 round is free. And then you just use whatever optic's going to make most sense. We get the 5 attachments on these guns. You don't even need a suppressor. So realistically, you can get down to about 4 attachments. And then you get full range to do whatever. If you don't like the irons, you can go an optic. You can go on a suppressor, which just takes you off the mini-map. If you feel like the recoil is an issue, you'd go with the compensator. The vertical, a lot of times you can go with the smaller mag on these, just because that helps with the movement significantly when it comes to these. The penalty for a bigger mag is often pretty bad for the SMGs because it hurts your sprint to fire time sometimes. So if we go here, you can see the penalties in the bottom right of the screen. They're pretty aggressive. So a lot of times you can go this way. Saves you the ADS and the sprint to fire, which 2 attachments that you're going to try and solve for. Ergonomic, CQB, commando, a little bit of preference on your play style. Are you really going to be diving all that much? Are you going to slide? Are you going to disable slide? Or are you going to disable dive or whatever? There's different settings you can go with that. Stock, you can go with the balance stock. Combat stock, sometimes people like. You can go with the fire mod. You can go and get overpressured, get a better bullet velocity. Reinforce, you can go at reinforce because the range on this is pretty good. And here's the part where it gets a little bit tricky. If the range sucks on the gun, it's generally going to be better to go for the long barrel. You can see that the long barrel pushes this up to about 20 meters. So that means your first damage drop off will go up to about 20 meters, which is pretty good, especially for the SMG. And then it'll feel much weaker once it has the next damage drop off. When you go with something like the reinforced, you can see that it's still at 17. So you're getting kind of a little bit of both, while still maintaining an insane bullet velocity where your bullet reg will feel good for a close range option. Not insane for long range. 742 is not particularly impressive, but for an SMG, that is very good. So we go with the reinforced when the range is already good. And then we go with long barrel when we're trying to solve for the range. And then you got to sacrifice the bullet velocity. So there's a little bit of a give and take there. This one, I'm fine with using the suppressor. And then we'll kind of see how these guns work. So we got the XM4. Still insanely low recoil. Super easy to use. But it's going to take a little bit more hit markers at those longer ranges. And then we have the KSV, which overall, pretty good gun. I think it's good. But like I said, it's third on the list. The next two are kind of tied. And the PPSH could be number 1 if they fix some of the issues with it, because there are a couple issues which we'll discuss. So that brings us to the top 2 here. AMES, I think it's a good alternative. But like I said, this one's kind of comparable to the XM4, XMG. If you like the Goblin, there's a lot of good options with this generally. And then they've got the PPSH. So build, pretty similar to what we've seen there. And then the PPSH is a little bit weird. We could also go, because we have the range, we get the extra bullet velocity. We don't need the long barrel. That'll pump it over 20 meters. Gain twist gives you a ton of bullet velocity. So technically you can go that route too. But I think reinforced works really well for this. And then you can kind of see how the build is. And one of the problems with this gun, as we get to it, I'll do the AMES first so you can just see that it's just pretty much a straight shooter. But what we have with this one is when you fire the weapon, it's going to have a lot of muzzle flash, a lot of smoke. With this particular build, it still has a lot of smoke, but it gets rid of that muzzle flash. If we go ahead and change the loadout just a little bit here, that's going to be one of the problems. Get rid of the suppressor. And then when we look at the gun here, it's going to have a lot of the fire coming off of it. So that kind of eliminates that fire part of it. Suppressor's not really necessary, but it does help a little bit with that visual, and that's also why we're using an optic. So that's one big problem with the PPSH, is it does have a lot of that muzzle flash, a lot of the smoke, and then the irons make it a little bit hard, not because the irons are hard, but because of those combination of factors. On top of that, it has kind of like a weird reload issue where you have to finish the entire reload. And it will like kind of allow you to, you have to actually wait for the full. You can't cancel it. So if you're accustomed to like getting the mag in and then swapping, which I think they'll fix that at some point. But overall, pretty solid build for both of these. Obviously the other one's not anything new, but this one, pretty good gun overall. I still think for whatever reason, the C9 just feels a little bit better. And then the Model L's, that low recoil, it just tends to hit a little bit harder than the other one consistently. You can see the build is up there. And then we have the 5 attachment, which again, this one is a little bit not as good range. So if we get rid of that, you can see it's only 13 meters. If we go with the reinforced, that'll get us to 15, which is pretty good. So you can go reinforced, but the long barrel is going to get us 17. So it kind of depends. If you feel like you're a little bit more aggressive at closing the distance, 2 meters is 2 meters. You can go reinforced, get the extra muzzle velocity, and then that'll be the difference there. And then if you feel like the recoil is an issue, you can go compensator, or you can even go another attachment, right? Like you can go optic if you don't like the irons, even though the irons are pretty good. So you got a couple different options to go with. Again, preferences will hold. And you can see that where we have this here, Model L. The fire rate is a little bit like different. Like I think I wish I could combine this with the other gun, but overall, like you can see it has a little bit of wiggle, but pretty straight overall, even on that 100-meter target. And then we're going to have the C9, which is pretty good. And again, 25 meters. You really shouldn't be challenging with an SMG at that range. Normally, if they're at this target, you should probably get a couple shots in and then end up finishing them off with the other gun. So let me know, what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think there's any other sleepers? I think the meta did get better with the Friday's update, but there's still a lot of things I think they can fix to make a little bit snipers a little bit more insane, make long range meta a little bit more insane. There's stuff that they can do, and when the game's not bugging out, it's a lot of fun, but it tends to bug out quite a bit. So we'll see how it goes. See you on the next one. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.